Many women grow up believing that kindness is the ultimate measure of their value, that the more they give, the more love they will receive. You were likely taught that being gentle, always helpful and accommodating is the path to approval, acceptance, and even safety. You were told that if you are sweet, if you bend over backward for everyone, if you put others' needs before your own, you will be loved, appreciated, and never abandoned. But the truth is far more subtle and far more dangerous. Kindness without boundaries is often mistaken for weakness, and weakness invites disrespect. When you give constantly, without discernment, you train people to take you for granted. A man notices not the sweetness in your heart, but the predictability of your responses. He sees that no matter what he does, you will give, you will forgive, you will adjust. Your kindness, when it is limitless and uncontrolled, loses its power. It becomes a pattern that others learn to exploit, not a gift that commands admiration. The more you bend over backward to please, the less your presence is valued. Men, consciously or unconsciously, are drawn to women who create balance, who have standards, who enforce limits. When you allow anyone to cross your emotional, mental, or physical boundaries without consequence, you are signaling that you are available not just in affection but in tolerance of disregard. And tolerance of disregard is the silent signal for disrespect. Many women confuse being kind with being desirable. They think that if they are always accommodating, always agreeable, they will never be rejected. But the truth is that kindness alone does not attract respect, it attracts expectation. If a man knows that you will always respond positively, that you will never challenge him, that your yes is automatic, your presence becomes something he can take lightly. Your value diminishes because there is no cost, no consequence, and no real indication that your love, attention, or effort is precious. Human beings, especially men, are wired to value that which they must earn. Without boundaries, your kindness becomes cheap. It is no longer a reflection of your heart, it is merely a routine they expect. Kindness without boundaries also creates a dangerous loop where your self-worth becomes dependent on others' reactions. You begin to measure your value by how much you give, how much you sacrifice, how much you adjust for others' comfort. This makes you vulnerable to manipulation. People, partners, friends, colleagues will sense the pattern and push against it, testing how far they can go before you resist. And many times, women who overgive fail to resist because they fear confrontation, they fear loss, and they fear being seen as mean or difficult. But the real cost is far greater than the temporary discomfort of setting limits. The cost is the erosion of self-respect, the slow but steady extinguishing of your inner power, and the training of everyone around you to undervalue and underestimate you. Boundaries are not a betrayal of kindness, they are its enhancement. A woman who gives selectively, who chooses when and how to extend her energy, is not cruel, she is wise. Her kindness becomes intentional, meaningful, and magnetic. When you stop giving indiscriminately, you reclaim your authority over your life, your choices, and your presence. You begin to see clearly who deserves your time and energy and who does not. This clarity does not make you unkind. It makes your kindness rare and precious, something that others must respect, earn, and appreciate. Without boundaries, your kindness is endless, and endlessness diminishes significance. With boundaries, your kindness becomes an act of power, a declaration of your value, and a magnetic force that draws admiration rather than entitlement. Disrespect rarely comes from malice. It comes from perception. When people perceive that your resources, emotional, mental, and physical, are unlimited, they act accordingly. They will test, push, and sometimes even betray the generosity you assume will never end. The problem is not them alone. It is the pattern you unconsciously allow. A woman who is kind without restraint is unknowingly creating an environment where her efforts are normalized, where her presence is undervalued, and where her sacrifices are expected. And once expectation replaces appreciation, resentment begins to form. Not theirs, but yours. You start to feel tired, unappreciated, even invisible, despite giving more than anyone else. Kindness without boundaries also blurs your identity. When you constantly adjust for others, when you allow your emotions, preferences, and desires to take a back seat, you lose touch with the very self that is supposed to define your life. You become a reflection of everyone else's wants, a service provider in human form, a perpetual giver without a center. Men notice this, often subconsciously, and it is not attractive. Strength is attractive. Confidence is attractive. A woman who has a core, who knows her limits, who enforces them calmly and consistently, is magnetic in a way that unconditional kindness can never achieve. It is the combination of generosity and discernment, love and authority, warmth and self-possession that commands attention, respect and desire simultaneously. Being kind without boundaries may feel safe because it avoids confrontation and rejection in the short term, but it erodes influence, power, and respect over time. True power lies not in giving endlessly, but in giving wisely. It lies not in pleasing everyone, but in commanding regard through your presence, your choices, and the sacred protection of your own energy. The woman who stops being indiscriminately kind does not stop being good-hearted. She begins to teach people how to treat her. She begins to enforce standards that ensure that her kindness is honored, not exploited. She begins to distinguish between those who appreciate her and those who take advantage of her generosity. A lack of boundaries in kindness is one of the most common reasons women experience frustration, disappointment, and relational stagnation. Time and time again, you may find yourself exhausted, undervalued, or overlooked, all while believing that the problem lies in others rather than in the pattern you have unconsciously reinforced. The truth is that boundaries are the framework within which kindness flourishes. Without them, kindness is invisible, undervalued, and taken for granted. With them, kindness transforms into respect, admiration, and desire. The woman who sets limits becomes the woman who commands attention. The woman whose love and generosity are considered precious rather than disposable. The woman whose presence is felt deeply and cherished consistently. Many women grow up believing that their kindness is their most valuable asset, that it defines their worth, and that the more they give, the more they are loved, respected, or admired. But there is a profound difference between being kind and being valuable, a difference that is rarely taught, yet it shapes the way the world responds to you. Kindness is an action. It is something you give. Value, on the other hand, is a presence. It is the energy, the authority, and the self-possession that commands attention without having to chase it. A woman can be endlessly kind and still remain invisible, overlooked, or undervalued. She can give, sacrifice, and accommodate, yet attract disregard, indifference, or even exploitation. Kindness, when unconditional and unchecked, becomes expected. A man may not see it as a reflection of your heart, but as a routine, something that will always be there. The same woman who smiles, listens, and nurtures may also be the one others take for granted. Her value is not recognized because her energy is offered without limits, without mystery, without the subtle assertion of her own worth. Value is earned not through endless giving, but through presence, self-respect, and the consistent demonstration that you are someone who commands consideration, someone whose time, energy, and attention are precious and not freely disposable. Many women confuse the ability to make others happy with their own significance. They believe that the measure of their worth is found in the reactions of others, in their ability to accommodate, soothe, and support. But kindness alone does not create influence, desire, or respect. You can be the sweetest, most selfless person in the room, yet if you lack boundaries, confidence, and self-awareness, people will undervalue you. Men, colleagues, and even friends instinctively measure worth by presence, strength, and subtle authority, not by the quantity of favors or compliments you give. A woman who is overly kind without enforcing limits teaches others that her resources, emotional, mental, and physical, are limitless, and the perception of endlessness diminishes the perception of value. Value, in contrast, is a quiet authority. It is the recognition that you do not have to prove your worth through constant action or approval. You do not have to overextend yourself to receive validation. You understand that the right people will respect you, seek you out, and cherish your presence without demanding endless proof of your generosity. A woman with value knows when to give and when to withhold, not out of malice, but out of awareness. She understands that her energy is a limited resource and that her attention, affection, and kindness are most potent when delivered with intention rather than habit. This creates a magnetic presence that is deeply attractive, not because of her actions alone, but because of the underlying assertion of her worth. Kindness without value can also become a trap, a cycle of approval seeking that leaves a woman exhausted and empty. She may find herself giving to people who do not deserve it, sacrificing her own priorities for the comfort of others, and confusing recognition with affection. Over time, This erodes self-esteem, leaving her dependent on external validation to feel worthy. Value, on the other hand, is internal. It is the energy that emanates from knowing that you are enough, that your presence is significant, and that you do not need to constantly prove your worth. A woman who embodies value attracts respect because she enforces standards subtly and consistently, creating an environment where her kindness is noticed, honored, and reciprocated rather than assumed. Another important distinction is that kindness is conditional in its effectiveness, while value is absolute. A kind act can bring temporary warmth, appreciation, or gratitude, but it rarely guarantees long-term admiration or loyalty. Value, however, shapes perception consistently. When a woman demonstrates her self-worth through her choices, her boundaries, and her sense of presence, she is recognized as someone important, someone who cannot be ignored, someone whose energy is inherently magnetic. Men, especially, respond to this kind of presence because it challenges them to engage, to pursue, and to invest emotionally rather than taking kindness for granted. Many women fear that prioritizing value over unconditional kindness is selfish or harsh, but the opposite is true. Ignoring value in favor of endless kindness can lead to exhaustion, resentment, and relational imbalance. By cultivating value alongside kindness, a woman ensures that her generosity is respected and cherished rather than exploited. This does not require her to become cold, unfeeling, or unapproachable. It requires her to cultivate self-awareness, discernment, and the quiet confidence that her worth is not measured by the actions she performs for others. In fact, when kindness is combined with value, it becomes far more potent. A woman who gives thoughtfully, selectively, and intentionally has her actions magnified in significance. People notice, admire, and remember her not because she gives endlessly, but because she gives from a position of strength. Value is also expressed through consistency and standards. While kindness can fluctuate depending on moods, circumstances, or desires to please, value is steady. It does not demand applause or recognition because it is inherent. A woman with value does not apologize, over-explain, or over-give. She communicates her limits subtly yet firmly. She is warm but not vulnerable to exploitation. She is generous but not endlessly available. This balance makes her presence magnetic and deeply respected, creating the kind of relationships where her kindness is reciprocated, appreciated, and never taken for granted. In the absence of value, kindness risks being invisible, undervalued, and normalized. In the presence of value, kindness becomes rare, magnetic, and unforgettable. Men, colleagues, friends, and partners instinctively respond to energy that is grounded in self-respect, self-possession, and quiet authority. They are drawn not to the woman who gives automatically, but to the woman who gives with awareness, who demonstrates that her attention is precious, and whose presence carries the weight of worth, not mere habit. Many women do not realize that the very kindness they consider a strength can, when unchecked, become a trap that quietly creates emotional debt in every interaction. Emotional debt is the invisible ledger that begins to accumulate the moment you give too much, forgive too easily, or accommodate too frequently. At first, it seems harmless. You offer support, you show patience, you sacrifice time or energy to make someone else comfortable. You feel good in the moment because giving feels noble, because helping feels virtuous, because kindness feels like a reflection of your heart. But over time, every act of unconditional giving begins to add up, not in gratitude, but in expectation, in entitlement, in the unspoken belief that you owe nothing less than unlimited generosity in return. Emotional debt is rarely discussed, yet it is one of the most powerful forces in human relationships. When you give too freely, people begin to unconsciously measure your worth by what they can take rather than by what they can give. Each favor, each act of accommodation, becomes a credit in their mind, a debt you have incurred simply by existing as someone willing to give. And unlike financial debt, emotional debt rarely comes with repayment in a clear, tangible form. Instead, it creates a subtle imbalance. People begin to expect more than you are willing or able to provide. They push boundaries and they take liberties with your time, your energy, and even your heart. The problem is not the act of giving itself, it is the absence of discernment, the absence of standards, the absence of limits. Many women operate under the assumption that kindness is infinite, that it can be given endlessly without consequence, and that it will always be met with appreciation. But human nature does not respond this way. People are wired to prioritize their own needs, often unconsciously. When kindness is boundless, it is taken for granted. When forgiveness is automatic, it is assumed. When attention is unconditional, it becomes invisible. The ledger of emotional debt grows silently, as others unconsciously subtract from your generosity while adding to their own sense of entitlement. One of the most insidious aspects of emotional debt is that it creates imbalance long before you even recognize it. At first, it may seem subtle, a man asking for more attention than usual, a friend who frequently calls on you without reciprocating, a colleague who continually leans on your support without acknowledgement. You may rationalize these patterns as normal, as natural, or even as proof of your indispensability. But what is actually happening is that your consistent giving has set a precedent. You have created a pattern in which your energy, your time, and your emotional labor are treated as commodities to be drawn upon at will, rather than as precious resources to be honored and respected. This imbalance eventually impacts your self-respect, your emotional well-being, and even your sense of self-worth. When you are constantly giving without limits, you risk losing sight of your own needs, desires, and boundaries. You may feel drained, unappreciated, or even resentful, yet struggle to confront others because you fear being labeled as selfish, mean, or difficult. The irony is that by avoiding this confrontation, you are reinforcing the very cycle that diminishes your value. Emotional debt is most dangerous because it is invisible. You cannot see it in the same way you see a financial ledger, yet it affects every interaction, every relationship, and every sense of your own power. Stopping emotional debt from forming requires awareness, courage, and the deliberate establishment of limits. It requires understanding that your kindness is a tool, not a mandate. It requires discerning when to give and when to withhold, when to offer support and when to demand reciprocity, when to forgive and when to enforce accountability. Emotional debt is not inherently bad. It becomes toxic only when your generosity is assumed, taken for granted, or exploited. By consciously controlling the flow of your kindness, you prevent the accumulation of unbalanced emotional obligations and reclaim the authority over your own energy. Another critical factor is perception. Most people do not think in terms of emotional debt, yet they intuitively respond to patterns of availability and generosity. When you give too much, too freely, you communicate to others that your presence is a resource without boundaries. Men, especially, are drawn to women who are generous but not infinite, nurturing but not endlessly available. The magnetism of a woman is often in what she chooses not to give, in the quiet assertion of her limits, and in the controlled rhythm of her attention and energy. Without these boundaries, kindness loses its potency. It becomes routine, expected, and invisible. The emotional ledger grows unchecked, and respect, desire, and admiration are replaced by entitlement and assumption. Kindness that creates emotional debt also obscures your value. When you overgive, you blur the lines between love, attention, and obligation. Others begin to equate your identity with your generosity rather than your presence. They may see you as helpful, accommodating, or dependable, but rarely as magnetic, powerful, or worthy of pursuit. Emotional debt subtly shifts the balance of power in relationships, transferring it from the woman who gives to those who receive. The dynamic is quiet but potent. Over time, the woman who once gave freely feels trapped in a cycle where her kindness is expected, her boundaries are tested, and her worth is measured by what she provides rather than who she is. The antidote to emotional debt is the conscious cultivation of selective generosity. Giving becomes a deliberate act of power rather than a default pattern of behavior. You learn to recognize the difference between those who deserve your energy and those who do not. You give fully, with intention, and without apology, but never blindly. You stop allowing your kindness to be interpreted as entitlement for others. You reclaim control over your energy, your presence, and your relationships. This is the moment when kindness transforms from vulnerability into authority, from routine into magnetism, and from obligation into influence. Detachment is one of the most misunderstood yet powerful tools a woman can wield. Many women confuse detachment with indifference, coldness, or lack of care, but in reality, detachment is the conscious choice to preserve your energy, your emotional stability, and your sense of self, regardless of external circumstances. It is the ability to remain centered, composed, and self-possessed, even in the presence of drama, emotional manipulation, or uncertainty. Detachment is not about withdrawing your love or kindness. It is about creating a space around yourself that allows others to recognize your worth without relying on your constant validation or approval. When practiced consistently, detachment amplifies your magnetic energy because it communicates strength, self-respect, and the understanding that your presence is not to be taken for granted. Magnetic energy is not born from pleasing or accommodating others. It is cultivated through the quiet assertion of boundaries, the clarity of intention, and the internal acknowledgement of your own value. A woman who is detached does not bend her energy to chase attention, does not overextend herself to prove love, and does not react impulsively to emotional provocation. Instead, she moves through life with a calm confidence, a centered presence, and an unwavering focus on her own priorities. This stillness, this refusal to be drawn into the chaos of others' expectations, is deeply attractive. It is magnetic because it contrasts sharply with the frantic, needy, and over-giving energy that so many women mistakenly equate with femininity. Detachment also creates emotional space that allows others to step forward and invest. When a woman is constantly available, emotionally, physically, or mentally, she unconsciously diminishes desire because there is no challenge, no mystery, and no effort required to earn her attention. But when a woman practices detachment, she signals that her energy is precious, that her presence is not guaranteed, and that her attention must be earned. This does not mean she withholds affection arbitrarily, it means she values herself enough to give selectively and intentionally. Detachment, therefore, is not cruelty, it is strategy. It is the conscious cultivation of magnetic energy by refusing to allow your own life to be dictated by the whims, insecurities, or demands of others. Another critical aspect of detachment is emotional self-sufficiency. A detached woman does not rely on external validation for her sense of worth. She does not measure her happiness, confidence, or self-esteem by the reactions of men, colleagues, or friends. Instead, she develops a deep internal reservoir of stability, fulfillment, and self-assurance. This independence is incredibly attractive because it communicates that she is complete, not incomplete. She does not cling, she does not chase, and she does not compromise her standards for fleeting approval. Men are drawn to women who are centered, confident, and emotionally sovereign because such women are rare, challenging to possess, and impossible to undervalue. Detachment also heightens your awareness of dynamics in relationships. When you are emotionally invested in every outcome, you lose perspective and allow others' behaviors to dictate your responses. Detachment allows you to observe interactions with clarity, notice patterns, and make conscious choices rather than reactive decisions. You begin to recognize when someone is taking advantage of your energy, testing your boundaries, or failing to meet your standards. With detachment, you no longer over-give or over-explain. You no longer apologize for asserting your presence or enforce invisible obligations upon yourself. Instead, you allow relationships to flow naturally with mutual respect as the baseline, and with your energy protected at all times. The paradox of detachment is that it amplifies connection rather than diminishes it. Many women fear that stepping back, withholding automatic kindness, or refusing to chase attention will create distance or rejection. But the opposite occurs when a woman is detached. She becomes a source of curiosity, desire, and admiration. Men and women alike are drawn to her because they sense a self-possession and a value that cannot be taken lightly. Detachment creates tension in the most beneficial way. It fosters pursuit rather than passivity, attention rather than assumption, and emotional investment rather than complacency. It transforms her energy from something ordinary into something magnetic, unforgettable, and deeply respected. Detachment is also a form of self-preservation. Women who are overly reactive, emotionally dependent, or habitually accommodating often burn themselves out, attracting partners and friends who exploit rather than reciprocate. Detachment allows you to maintain your equilibrium even in the presence of toxicity, drama, or instability. You learn to respond selectively, not impulsively. You learn to care without sacrificing yourself. You learn to extend energy with intention rather than habit. Over time, this deliberate practice strengthens your presence, deepens your self-respect, and solidifies the magnetic energy that naturally commands admiration, desire, and attention. Finally, detachment is a quiet form of power. It does not require loud declarations, emotional manipulation, or aggressive assertion. Its strength lies in subtlety, the calm authority of a woman who knows her worth, protects her energy, and refuses to overgive in order to be noticed or loved. Her energy is magnetic because it is deliberate, consistent, and anchored in self-respect. She does not chase, she does not plead, and she does not compromise her standards for fleeting attention. Men sense this power intuitively. They feel the pull, the challenge, and the rarity of her presence, and they respond with focus, admiration, and investment. Many women spend their lives unconsciously seeking the approval of others, believing that love, acceptance, or validation is something they must earn by accommodating, pleasing, or adjusting themselves to the expectations of those around them. From a young age, society teaches women that being liked is more important than being respected, that being agreeable is more desirable than being self-possessed, and that prioritizing others' opinions is a path to security, stability, and even happiness. The problem with this approach is subtle but profound. Approval seeking erodes self-respect. When your sense of value depends on external validation, your energy becomes fragmented, your presence loses authority, and your attractiveness diminishes because the people around you sense the underlying neediness. Self-respect, however, is the antidote to approval seeking, and when cultivated, it transforms not only how others perceive you, but also how you perceive yourself. Approval seeking is exhausting because it is never ending. No matter how much you adjust, please, or accommodate, there will always be someone whose opinion matters more than your own, someone whose expectations seem impossible to meet, someone who tests the limits of your generosity and patience. A woman who seeks approval sacrifices her needs, desires, and boundaries in an attempt to be good enough in the eyes of others. She may smile when she doesn't feel like it, agree when she disagrees, and give when she does not have the energy. Over time, this pattern erodes confidence, breeds resentment, and subtly teaches others that her energy and presence are available at any cost. Self-respect, by contrast, replaces the need for constant validation with an internal compass. It allows a woman to navigate her relationships, her career, and her personal life from a place of authority rather than dependence. When self-respect becomes the foundation of behavior, a woman no longer bends herself to fit the expectations of others. She does not over-apologize for existing, nor does she over-explain her choices to gain favor. Her decisions, her priorities, and her boundaries are clear and consistent, and she does not compromise them for the fleeting approval of anyone. This stability is magnetic because it communicates strength and integrity. Men, in particular, respond instinctively to women who demonstrate self-respect because such women set the tone for how they are treated. Approval-seeking communicates insecurity, unpredictability, and over-availability. Self-respect communicates authority, confidence, and deliberate energy. Another critical aspect of replacing approval-seeking with self-respect is emotional sovereignty. A woman who seeks validation allows others' moods, opinions, and reactions to dictate her emotional state. If someone is displeased, she internalizes it as a reflection of her worth. If someone is indifferent, she worries she has failed. This constant external calibration creates vulnerability and weakness in her presence. Self-respect, however, establishes emotional independence. A woman who respects herself internally does not allow others to define her mood, her worth, or her sense of satisfaction. She responds to the world from a place of centered power rather than reactive dependence, and this internal equilibrium enhances her attractiveness because it communicates stability, confidence, and unshakable authority. Self-respect also changes the way generosity and kindness are expressed. When a woman seeks approval, she gives endlessly in hopes of being liked or validated. Her kindness becomes transactional. She gives to receive, she accommodates to be appreciated, she sacrifices to maintain favor. But self-respect transforms generosity into intentionality. A woman with self-respect gives thoughtfully, selectively, and consistently according to her values, not to anyone else's expectations. Her actions are a reflection of her principles rather than a plea for recognition. Men and women alike are drawn to this energy because it signals strength, intentionality, and authority. It transforms kindness from a predictable routine into a powerful magnet for respect, desire, and emotional investment. Replacing approval seeking with self-respect also allows a woman to enforce boundaries without guilt. Approval seekers often hesitate to say no, fearing conflict, disapproval, or rejection. They allow themselves to be taken advantage of, misrepresented, or overlooked because they crave affirmation. Self-respect, however, creates clarity. Boundaries are non-negotiable, priorities are maintained, and energy is protected. Saying no is not rude or mean, it is a deliberate act of preserving authority over one's life. This clarity communicates strength, independence, and value, qualities that are universally recognized and deeply magnetic. Finally, self-respect replaces approval seeking by teaching a woman to prioritize herself without guilt. She no longer measures her worth through the lens of others' judgments. She no longer sacrifices her peace, her energy, or her boundaries for the sake of being liked. Her choices are deliberate, her presence is intentional, and her relationships are balanced. Men, colleagues, friends, and even strangers sense this authority instinctively. They do not need to be told that she is valuable. Her energy announces it. Approval-seeking communicates scarcity, insecurity, and dependence. Self-respect communicates abundance, confidence, and sovereign presence. It transforms not only how others interact with you, but how you interact with yourself, creating a life that is magnetic, intentional, and unshakably powerful. Generosity is often praised as a universal virtue, but like every tool, its power lies not in quantity, but in intention. Many women believe that giving endlessly, whether it be attention, emotional energy, time, or affection, is the highest expression of love, kindness, or value. They operate under the assumption that the more they give, the more they will be appreciated, loved, or desired. The truth is, generosity without control is rarely magnetic. It can be invisible, taken for granted, and even exploited. Power lies not in giving endlessly, but in giving intentionally. Controlled generosity is the art of distributing your energy with precision, awareness, and self-respect, creating an aura of magnetism, respect, and desire that cannot be achieved through mindless overgiving. Controlled generosity begins with self-awareness. A woman who wields her energy intentionally understands the difference between authentic giving and habitual overextension. She recognizes the cost of her generosity, the emotional, mental, and physical resources she invests, and she carefully chooses when and to whom those resources are extended. Unlike the woman who gives automatically to anyone who asks, she gives selectively, ensuring that her attention, care, and affection are appreciated, reciprocated, or earned. In doing so, she creates scarcity around her generosity, which paradoxically makes it more valuable. People notice, desire, and respect what is not freely available, and controlled generosity naturally commands these responses. The power of controlled generosity also lies in its ability to establish boundaries without confrontation. A woman who gives indiscriminately invites expectation, entitlement, and emotional debt because others unconsciously assume her energy is infinite. But when generosity is delivered selectively, boundaries are inherently communicated. People learn that her time, her attention, and her support are not to be taken lightly. This subtle assertion of authority cultivates respect without the need for constant enforcement, drama, or explanation. Men, colleagues, friends, and even strangers respond instinctively to controlled generosity because it signals value, power, and self-possession in ways that endless giving cannot. Controlled generosity is also deeply magnetic because it introduces intentionality into interactions. Every act of giving becomes meaningful, deliberate, and memorable. The woman who gives without thought or limitation blends into the background. Her actions are expected and eventually overlooked. The woman who gives with awareness creates impact. When she smiles, listens, or invests her energy, it carries weight because it is measured, intentional, and rare. This selectivity signals to others that she is a person of substance whose energy is worthy of attention, admiration, and pursuit. Her presence becomes magnetic not because she is endlessly available, but because she is consistently intentional. Another critical aspect of controlled generosity is emotional leverage. Women who give without limits often become emotionally drained and frustrated because they fail to receive the respect, reciprocity, or consideration they intuitively expect. By controlling generosity, a woman ensures that her energy is protected and that her relationships are balanced. She does not allow herself to be manipulated or overextended because she understands that every act of giving carries influence. Controlled generosity becomes a silent authority, a subtle yet powerful tool that draws attention, fosters desire, and commands investment without requiring confrontation, argument, or assertion. Controlled generosity also reinforces self-respect and boundaries. A woman who gives indiscriminately often sacrifices her own priorities, peace, and stability in the pursuit of approval or acceptance. Controlled generosity, however, is rooted in the principle that your energy is precious and must be guarded. She gives in alignment with her values and only when it does not compromise her well-being or integrity. This approach ensures that her presence and her actions are respected, not taken for granted. People instinctively recognize the difference between someone who gives freely because she is desperate for approval and someone who gives intentionally because she values herself. Power in generosity is also about creating contrast. Humans are naturally drawn to that which is scarce and valuable. Endless availability dulls desire. Predictability diminishes influence. Habitual over-giving erodes admiration. Controlled generosity, by contrast, creates a rhythm of attention and energy that is rare, deliberate, and impactful. People are drawn to it, they notice it, and they respond with greater appreciation, effort, and respect. The woman who controls her giving elevates her presence from ordinary to magnetic, from expected to extraordinary. Her kindness, attention, and affection are no longer a commodity. They are a privilege, and people respond accordingly. Finally, controlled generosity transforms relationships. It ensures that your interactions are reciprocal, your energy is valued, and your presence is respected. By giving with intention rather than habit, you cultivate admiration rather than entitlement, desire rather than dependence, and loyalty rather than assumption. It is a practice of self-mastery, a subtle yet powerful demonstration that your energy, time, and affection are not infinite, and that they are only extended to those who recognize, respect, and value them. Controlled generosity does not make a woman cold, unfeeling, or inaccessible. It makes her magnetic, powerful, and unforgettable because she has mastered the art of giving without sacrificing authority, self-respect, or influence.